to do anything useful, they need to integrate with backend systems, on-premise, cloud, or internet-based. In this video, I explain how backend integration works in Oracle Intelligent Bots. Welcome, my name is Frank Nimphius and I'm from the Oracle Mobile Platform team. And with no further ado, let's go straight in. Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise, which Oracle Intelligent Bots is part of, provides connectors for REST, SOAP, Fusion App and Integration Cloud Service to integrate with remote services. And it is this functionality that makes it easy for custom components to integrate with backend systems. Architecturally, you always want to access connectors through a shared custom API. And I talked about the benefits of this approach in an earlier video. And now it's a good time to introduce another SDK that exists in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise and that can be used within custom components. To make it easy for chatbots to access Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise custom API and connectors, we provide a server-side SDK, the Mobile SDK. The Mobile SDK is part of Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise and is accessible from every custom API. And just to remind you that bot custom component services in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise are custom APIs. Besides of giving you access to a custom API and connectors, the Mobile SDK also provides a function to access Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise platform services like analytics, logging, storage, database, notification, and other. Now, of course, if a custom component wants to access the Mobile SDK, then it needs to get a reference to it. But how? Well, a feature of the Bot SDK that I did not talk about in a previous recording is the ability to hold and expose references to other JavaScript objects. Using this feature, the Mobile SDK is passed to the custom component by the shell object, which each call of the component invoke method. The shell object itself gets its reference to the Mobile SDK from the custom component service, which is the custom API. So for the remaining of this video, let's go over an example for you to understand how to set up the backend integration in a custom component. Well, Hello World doesn't require backend integration, so it's not really a suitable example. So what about a currency converter, like I mentioned in previous videos? No objection? So let's go for it. Before looking at the example, here are basic steps to follow. First, we need to create a connector. In our case, it's a REST connector. Then we need to create the common shared API to access the connector. Then we need to configure the shared API with our custom component service. And eventually, we need to access the shared API from our custom component logic. In a previous video, you've seen me developing a custom component service from start to end. Therefore, for this video, I will leave it to what's really important, which means we are looking at an existing example. This is the website of the Fixer.io currency conversion, which is a service provided by European Central Bank. If we scroll down, we see how this site wants to be used. So we do have an API, which is a GET request we can send to latest to get the latest currency conversions. And this is then for the base currency, which is Euro. We can also change the base currency, in this case to US dollar. Or we can have symbols, which is that we reduce the information that we get to, in this case, two currencies, US dollar and British pound. Now, this basically then is the URI that we need to put into the connector in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise, and this is what I show you next. We're now in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise and we see a REST connection that I created for the Fixer.io website. In the general overview, we see the display name for the API, but most important for us is the URI that we see here, because this URI is what we need to register with a custom API that we use as a shared layer. And I will show you that in a minute. Then we do have the descriptor. Now the descriptor, in this case, I don't have one because I'm pointing it to the REST endpoint, which is the root URL of the site. Rules, we don't have rules. These are query parameters that you always want to send with a request. So instead of providing these on top of the other query parameters, you can define rules, in which case the system will put these query parameters to the request. Security, well, it's self-explaining. We don't have an authenticated REST service to access, so for that reason we don't need security. So I can go straight to testing my service. And there's a tester page for that. So here we see the local URI, which is our descriptor string. I put a valid URI query string here, which is latest for the latest currency conversion. And I want to reduce the amount of information we get to British pound and the US dollar. For testing, I select a mobile backend, so whatever backend I want to use for that, doesn't really matter. And then I hit endpoint to test it. So successful, and we see the response that we get is a conversion rate for British pound and for US dollar. Now this is what we actually access through the connector, and the next step would be then to write a custom API that accesses this connector to query the information based on then what comes from the bot to some point in time. Here we are in the Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise environment, and as you can see, I defined two custom APIs. One is the currency converter CCS API, which is my custom component service, and I defined a currency converter API as a shared layer so that it can be used with different channels. The currency converter custom component service is created the way that I explained it in a previous video. So we will focus on the shared layer here, open it, and there are two things I want to point out. One is that this URI string is what we need later to register our shared API with the custom component service so that the custom components can access the shared layer. And the second thing is the endpoint. You see that I defined one endpoint that has one resource, which is called converter, and that it uses a post method. So you might wonder how I'm using a post method where the connector requires a GET call to the Fix.io website. And that's true. However, the connector has to call a remote service the way that service wants to be called. The way that you call the connector, however, is up to you because the custom API wraps the call to the connector. So in my case, I decided to have a post method call for the shared layer, as it makes it easier for developers to pass complex payloads. You can imagine that passing a payload in a request body is a lot easier than encoding it as a query string. And this way, I decided to have a post method call for this shared layer. And we'll see how this works in code when I introduce the custom component service access to the shared layer in a minute. Here we are in the ATEM JavaScript editor, and I have two projects or two custom APIs. One is my custom component service, and the other one is the shared API layer. The shared API layer accesses the connector in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise, and for this it has a mobile dependency created in the package.json file. And this dependency is for connectors, pointing to the connector that we have defined for the Fix.io website. The implementation file, first of all, listens for a post method. As I mentioned, using post is a lot easier to pass information to. The information that we get in the request object is a JSON object, date set to latest for the latest currency conversion, unless we want to see historical conversion data. A base currency is a JSON object with a currency symbol and the base amount, and then the target currency as an array. If we scroll down, then here in line 54, this is actually where the request to the connector happens. So from the request object that gets passed into the post function, there is an subfunction called Oracle Mobile that gives you access to the Mobile SDK from the shared API. Remember that I said the SDK can be used from any custom API. So it then calls the foreign exchange connector, passes the resource, which in our case is the string latest, and provides a query string, which is the base currency, and the target currency strings. Then it calls the function result, and here is where we then process the response and return a JSON object back to whoever called it. Now, one client to call it is the custom component. So if you go to the custom component, then this also has a package.json file. And here I have an Oracle Mobile dependency again, but this time I have it to APIs. Why not to the connector? Because we're accessing the REST connector through the shared API. And the shared API is called currency converter, and we just saw that. In my custom component, which I have here, I do have the invoke method. It's here. And this reads from the input properties the base currency, the base amount, and the target currency entity name as it is sent from the bot. And here in the metadata section, we have these properties defined: the base currency, base amount, and the target currency, as well as the variable that is a reference to the NLP result. Why do we need to have a reference to the NLP result? Well, as I mentioned in a previous video, you don't actually know how many target currencies you have to look at. And the easiest way to get all of the unknown number of target currencies is to work with entity matches. So for this, we pass in the string of the entity name, and then we get an array back of all the values that you can find for this string. And then further down, here we start building the request body, so the payload. So we pass the date as latest, we define a JSON object for the base currency, and then we define the target currency as the array of currencies that we get from the match entity call. And then, last but not least, this here is the call to the custom API. So again, conversation.Oracle Mobile is the reference to the Mobile SDK. And this Mobile SDK now calls the currency converter, issues a post request, references the resource, which is converter, and passes in the body. If we look at the invoke method, then we see this is the bot SDK reference, and I had a video where I explained the SDK and talked about how this is exposed to a custom component. The question now is, how do we get access to the mobile SDK in this bot SDK? And as I mentioned in the video, there is the component service that has access to the mobile SDK and that passes this into the bot SDK. So let's have a look at the converter custom component service. And if we go to line 35, then we see that it defines a constant SDK mixin. And here it defines the JSON object as a value with the name Oracle Mobile, and then a reference to request.Oracle Mobile. And this string is exactly the same that we've seen on the shared custom API layer, because every custom API in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise gets access to the request object, and part of the request object is a reference to the mobile SDK, which now is sitting here in the SDK mixin variable. So when the shell object invokes the component by name, which basically means it calls its invoke method, then as a third argument, SDK mixin is passed in. And this is how a custom component gets access to the mobile SDK, to access custom APIs, to access connectors, and to access platform services. Before wrapping up, let me share a secret. All of the integration code you've seen, I didn't write myself. All code access to connectors and custom APIs in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise is available in the product documentation, ready for copy and paste. You see how easy it is. I hope you enjoyed this video and you stay tuned for the next.